Kim and Kimberly, two 30-something friends, worked in the fashion industry in New York City. After months of hard work, they decided to take a well-deserved break and embark on a road trip across the United States. They planned to visit remote and off-the-beaten-path locations to fully immerse themselves in the American wilderness. They set off in their rental car, an old station wagon, and headed towards the first point on their itinerary, a small village nestled among the mountains of Colorado. The journey went smoothly, with laughter, chatter, and songs on the radio. Upon arriving in the village, they found a strange atmosphere. The few people they encountered seemed to regard the two friends with suspicion and distrust. They decided not to dwell on it and settled into a small motel on the outskirts of town. The receptionist, an elderly woman with a stern demeanor, greeted them coldly and handed them the key to their room with barely a word. Kim and Kimberly felt uneasy, but attributed the feeling to travel fatigue. During the night, they were awakened by strange noises coming from outside. It sounded like someone was scraping against the door of their room. Kim got up to check, but saw no one through the peephole. She returned to bed, but the noises continued intermittently throughout the night, preventing the two friends from sleeping. The next morning, exhausted and confused, they decided to leave the motel and the village as soon as possible. As they loaded their luggage into the car, they noticed that one of the tires was flat. Someone had slashed it during the night. A shiver of fear ran through them, but they tried to stay calm. They changed the tire and quickly drove off, eager to leave behind that unsettling place. They drove for hours, venturing deeper into remote and isolated areas. The landscape became increasingly rugged and desolate. At one point, the GPS stopped working, and they found themselves lost in the middle of nowhere. The sun was setting, and they had no idea where they were. They decided to stop and seek help. In the distance, they saw an old abandoned gas station. They approached, hoping to find someone, but the place seemed deserted. They entered the dilapidated building, searching for a phone or a map. Inside, they found only old dusty shelves and cobwebs. A nauseating smell hung in the air. Suddenly, they heard a noise coming from the back of the gas station. They approached cautiously and saw a partially open door. With their hearts pounding, Kim slowly opened it. What they saw took their breath away. A bare room with a dirty mattress on the floor, covered in dark stains. Newspaper articles and photographs of young women hung on the walls, some of which appeared to have been taken secretly. In a panic, the two friends realized they were in a dangerous place. They ran towards the car, but to their horror, they found that it wouldn't start. Someone had tampered with the engine. They heard footsteps approaching and realized they were not alone. A menacing figure emerged from the shadows, wielding an axe. Kim and Kimberly fled into the surrounding wilderness, desperately seeking shelter. They could feel their pursuer close behind, his heavy breathing growing nearer. They stumbled and fell into a ditch, hiding among the dense vegetation. They remained motionless, holding their breath as the man with the axe searched for them in the night. After what felt like endless hours, the pursuer seemed to move away. The two friends, exhausted and terrified, silently embraced, trying to muster courage from each other. They knew they had to find a way to escape from this nightmare and get to safety. With the first light of dawn, they cautiously made their way through the forest, hoping to come across a road or a sign of civilization. They walked for hours until they were nearly spent, when they heard the distant sound of an approaching vehicle. It was a pickup truck driven by an elderly farmer who stopped upon seeing them in distress. The two friends, in tears, recounted their terrible experience to the man, who offered to accompany them to the nearest police station. As they drove away from those accursed woods, Kim and Kimberly held hands, grateful to have survived that waking nightmare. They knew it would take time to overcome the trauma of that night, but they were determined to leave behind that horror and take back control of their lives. Back in New York, they decided never to speak of what they had experienced again, but both knew that the memory of that nightmare journey would haunt them forever. Ross, Sheila, Colton, and Kate, 4 inseparable college friends, decided to embark on a road trip across the United States during the summer break. They meticulously planned their route, opting to visit off-the-beaten-path and less touristy locations. Full of enthusiasm and a thirst for adventure, they set off in their car, unaware of what lay ahead. After a few hours of driving, the car began to experience issues. They pulled over at a small workshop in the middle of nowhere, where a mechanic with an unsettling appearance offered to fix the vehicle. While they waited, Kate noticed peculiar behavior from the mechanic, who seemed to stare at them intently. Despite the tense atmosphere, the car was repaired, and the group set off again, eager to leave behind that unpleasant experience. Along the way, Colton suggested taking a detour to visit a small town he had heard was particularly charming. The others agreed, intrigued by the idea of discovering an unknown place. However, as they approached the town, the atmosphere grew increasingly ominous and oppressive. The houses appeared abandoned, and there was not a soul in sight. They decided to stop at a small diner to ask for information. Inside, they found only an elderly waiter with a weathered face and vacant gaze. The man answered their questions cryptically, hinting at a dark history associated with the town. Growing more uneasy by the minute, the group decided to leave as soon as possible. As night fell, the 4 friends decided to camp at a rest area along the road. While setting up their tents, Sheila noticed a figure in the distance watching them. When she alerted the others, the figure disappeared into the darkness. Despite their unease, they decided to stay and take turns keeping watch throughout the night. During his watch, Ross heard noises coming from the surrounding forest, sounds of footsteps and breaking branches drawing closer. With a sinking feeling in his stomach, he woke the others, and together they decided to leave immediately, abandoning the campsite. Driving through the night, the group came across an old motel along the road. Exhausted and frightened, they decided to stop and rest. The receptionist, a woman with an odd demeanor, greeted them with an enigmatic smile. Once in their rooms, they began to hear unsettling noises coming from the walls in the hallway. Unable to sleep, the 4 friends gathered to discuss their next move. They decided to leave the motel immediately and drive through the night until they reached a larger city. As they got into the car, they noticed the receptionist watching them from the window with a sinister gaze. After hours of exhausting driving, the group finally reached a familiar city. Exhausted and shaken by their experiences, they decided to end the journey and return home. Despite being safe, they couldn't shake off the feeling of still being watched and followed. Once back home, the 4 friends tried to resume their normal lives, but the experiences they had during the trip continued to haunt them. Therefore, they decided never to speak to anyone about what they had been through. Devin, a 25-year-old aspiring photographer, was thrilled about his first major assignment. After years of hard work and sacrifice, he finally had the opportunity to do a photo shoot for a prominent magazine in Boston. His passion for photography had developed since childhood, when his grandfather had given him his first camera. From that moment on, Devin had devoted himself entirely to perfecting his technique and creating unique and compelling images. The journey to Boston was long, but Devin didn't feel tired. He was too excited about the chance to showcase his talent and make a name for himself in the world of photography. He carefully prepared all the necessary equipment: cameras, lenses, filters, and tripods. He studied the job brief attentively and already had some ideas in mind to make the shoot memorable. During the journey, Devin decided to make a detour to visit a small town that he had heard was particularly picturesque. Upon arrival, he was fascinated by the vintage atmosphere and the architecture of the buildings. He began taking some photos, trying to capture the essence of the place. However, as he explored the deserted streets, he began to feel a strange sense of unease. It was as if someone was watching him, but he couldn't see anyone. Devin decided to ignore that feeling and continued taking photos. At one point, he came across an old abandoned building that seemed to be the perfect subject for some evocative shots. He entered, making his way through the debris and dust. The atmosphere was eerie, and the silence was broken only by the sound of his footsteps. Suddenly, he heard a creak coming from upstairs. His heart started pounding in his chest, but he decided to investigate. Climbing the stairs, Devin found himself in a dark and dusty room. The light filtering through the broken windows created eerie shadows on the walls. That's when he noticed an old camera resting on a table. It was an antique model, similar to the one his grandfather had given him. Intrigued, Devin picked it up and began to examine it. Suddenly, he heard a noise behind him and turned around abruptly, but there was no one there. Devin decided it was time to leave. As he headed towards the exit, the camera he had found started taking photos on its own. The flash intermittently illuminated the room, creating a strobe-like effect. Terrified, Devin dropped the camera and ran out of the building. Once outside, he realized it was just a malfunction of the camera, but the experience had shaken him deeply. Finally arriving in Boston, Devin tried to focus on the job. The shoot was demanding, but he gave it his all. However, he couldn't shake off the feeling of unease he had felt in the abandoned building. Every time he looked through the lens of his camera, it seemed like he could see shadows moving in the background. One evening, as Devin reviewed the photos taken during the shoot, he noticed something strange. In some of the images, there were blurry figures in the background that seemed to be watching him. At first, he thought they were just defects, but the more he looked at them, the more he felt like those figures were following him. He decided to delete the photos and focus on his work, but the unease wouldn't leave him. Back home after work, Devin couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the figures in the photos and the experience in the abandoned building. He decided to do some research on the internet and discovered that the small town he had visited had a dark history. It was said to have been the scene of tragic and unexplained events in the past. From that moment on, Devin began to feel increasingly paranoid. He had the constant feeling of being watched and followed. Even when he was alone at home, he felt like he heard strange noises and saw shadows out of the corner of his eye. He started to withdraw more and more, avoiding contact with people and obsessively dedicating himself to photography. One night, Devin woke up suddenly. He had dreamt about the abandoned building and the blurry figures in the photos. He got out of bed and went to the bathroom to splash water on his face. When he looked up at the mirror, he saw a figure behind him. He turned around abruptly, but there was no one there. He realized that his mind was playing tricks on him, but he couldn't shake off the fear that gripped him. Devin was never the same again. He continued his life as a photographer, but the passion that once drove him seemed to have faded. He was constantly haunted by memories of that unsettling experience and the figures that seemed to haunt him. No one knew what had truly happened to him on that trip to Boston, but one thing was certain. His life had changed completely from that moment on.